So patch 14.1, the largest patch of the set, the first patch of the year, is finally here, and it's been a couple of days. We can finally start talking about the way that the meta has evolved, it's shifted, the different lines that have been going about. Thank God to the death of TD Spat, amongst a bunch of other things. There's a bunch to cover, so we're just gonna hop honestly right into it and start talking about all the different compositions you should be aware of, all the different lines you should know if you're trying to climb competitively on 14.1. So first off, let's talk about Twisted Fate. Twisted Fate has sort of popped up into the meta. In case you didn't see all of the buffs and the patches, this comp got buffed in numerous of ways. Lulu got buffed, Nami got buffed, TF got buffed. I think some other stuff got buffed. If I remember correctly, I think this comp Tarek got buffed. This comp got buffed like I think like 5, 6, 7 different ways. So it was quite insane to see how this comp just suddenly re-emerged out of nowhere. And a lot of pro players were actually talking about this before the patch, how disco was not really a competitive line unless you could hit everything else. And once you capped out with your legendaries, then you actually can play disco. It's actually not even that bad. But now we're saying that disco is sort of taking over almost every single lobby. You see it every single time. It's a very straightforward, easy to play composition, and quite honestly, starting from 2-1, you can basically pilot into disco, commit to it, and you should be good to go. Normally things like Nami headliner, things like Tarek headliner, both with like +2 disco, totally takeable. You just take them, you can play like 4 disco on 2-1, and you have a decently solid board. It's going to get you throughout all of the early game and most of the mid game. But talking about the board real quick, if you already know, it is disco headliner almost every single time. You can also settle for the dazzler headliner as well for TF. That's totally fine as well. You are playing 4 dazzlers, you're going to have to just drop down one of the disco units, most likely Tarek, because it's kind of a shitter regardless, and you just play 4 dazzler, 5 disco, and you are chilling. To be completely honest with you, I actually like the 4 dazzler one a little bit better. I think 6 disco is really, really strong. It tempos you to 9, but then you sort of hit a wall kind of quick, and it's easier to cap out with 4 dazzler faster when you hit the dazzler TF, but nonetheless, it's still okay. Nonetheless, I don't know why I keep saying nonetheless. It's like my favorite word recently. I don't fucking know why. Itemizations include things like steadfast heart, redemption, really strong tank items that you want on your blitzcrank. You also kind of want the spark on blitzcrank as well. It doesn't have to go on him, it can go on any other strong tank, but realistically, just throw it onto blitzcrank. You get 3 items onto here, and then you can start focusing on Lowy items, and you should be really much all set. Things like the tentacles are really important as well, because one of Twisted Fate's hardest matchups is actually going to be pentakill karthus, which we'll talk more about a little bit later. But pentakill karthus and karthus akali, these comps really fuck over TF because he takes a little too long to ramp up and get all of his damage out, and Karthus can actually just one-shot him with the help of Akali. So this composition without Alawi can feel really bad because you need the tentacles to soak up those extra Karthus casts. So make sure to keep that in mind. Sona, it's almost always going to be the attack speed Sona still. Yes, even though the damage one got buffed, as of right now, it's still going to be attack speed Sona like 90% of the time. But once you start itemizing her into certain matchups, things like Ginsu's, things like Shojin, right? And you're playing into things like Yone Reroll, for example. Surprisingly enough, we're starting to see a lot of people actually pivot into damage Sona for very late game fights, especially against those really large and like behemoths of units, Riven and Yone, which we'll talk about later down the line. But basically, the way that you beat those boards with Disco, you have 2 options. You can either try to burst it down immediately as possible, try to get the Sona to cast ASAP, like things like double Shojin or even Adapticone is totally fine with double Ginsu's or whatever, but that plus the Twisted Fate, try to aim your Twisted Fate right behind, or I guess right in front of the opponent's Yone or Riven, and then you try to burst it down as soon as possible with the Sona casting at the same time, clearing it, and then you're good to go. Another sort of more traditional approach is just sticking with the attack speed Sona. That's totally okay, but try to be a little more open to the idea of playing damage Sona. I think it'll be pretty surprising. You'd be kind of amazed at how well this thing can go. Another thing to keep in mind, a very popular augment to take is stationary support. This augment basically, if you've been living under a rock or maybe you haven't touched TFT at all, gives you a training dummy with a support item on it. But some of these support items can be really difficult to position. So the best way to actually position your units is using what's called the for lack of a better term, ball sack positioning. This was coined by none other than the Masio Raptor. He just called it that yesterday. I don't know why, but fuck it. It kind of looks like titties from Valorant, if you've ever played on Breeze before. But basically, the idea is that this trading dummy, you can actually garner all the value out of the hexes. The trading dummy itself won't get the disco buff, but that doesn't really matter. And you just get all the value onto your backliners here. Things like the Sona, things like the Nami, things like Ziggs, right? They all get that Ziggs Herald value, and you're chilling. You can also use this positioning as well for your front line if you get something like Chalice. Although I will say this positioning can feel a little bit bad, especially without the Alawi, because let's say, for example, you haven't found the Alawi alawi yet, but you're playing something like a Zac, now you have this like entire row where the enemy front line can just kind of like close in a bit, and you can feel a little suffocated, and that can feel a little bit bad. So just keep that in mind. This isn't good for every single matchup. If you have stationary support, you might see yourself positioning like this a bit more often. Finally, for capping out the board as well, you always want to be ending with 4 Dazzler if you're trying to play Twisted Fate. 4 Dazzler is easily the best way to cap out your board, but if you want to get the double disco balls on your board, you need at least 5, so that means you are fishing for that disco headliner. It has to be disco for Twisted Fate or onto the Blitzcrank. Either is fine, nothing really changes either or, but keep in mind that if this is the case, we are taking out of the Taric. So we did have a Taric on our board earlier, and then we just take it off. Again, the reason being is just the weakest link out of all the disco units. Nami provides a lot of CC, is also a Dazzler. Gragas is bruisers for alawi. Blitzcrank is obviously Blitzcrank. Twisted Fate is obviously Twisted Fate. So you get the idea. Obviously, really good emblems to hit is just the disco emblem, which is absolutely nuts. But things like the hyper pop and also Dazzler emblems, these are also fine as well. Just keep these, just keep an eye out in case you ever find them. But this is a very standard way to cap out your board. Ziggs, Bard, Sona, very easy. You can actually go 10 with a board like this if you manage to get this far and there's still a decent amount of HP left in the lobby. You're in a pretty disgustingly high roll spot if that's the case, but nonetheless, you should be good to go. In terms of tertiary items, again, Sona is the best one to be itemizing third after you get the Twisted Fate and Blitzcrank items. You want to start thinking about Ginsu's, Shojin, Adaptive Helm, right? These are all great on Sona, but you can also, if you find like a very early Ziggs too, or if you have a lot of AP items that aren't necessarily good for Sona, feel free to start itemizing Ziggs. Totally fine. Things like the red buff, things like a Rabadon, things like Shiv, not Shiv, he has innate Shed, you don't need Shiv. Nashers, right? Things like these, right? These are very good on Ziggs, and he can just utilize these, just get some casts off, just get this spread the, what is it called? The magic resist, fucking shred, whatever the fuck, into the back, right? He sprazzles his dazzle everywhere, and there you go. It's all over the floor, and nobody has MR. Yeah, great. One last thing to note, TF items, the itemization has changed a little bit. BIS is sort of agreed upon that it's like Gunblade, Archangel, Morello, but there is some discussion to be made because Rabadons did get changed with the new changes in the patch. Now it gives 50 AP but 20% bonus damage, which is kind of a fucking lot. Rabadons can be totally fine as a substitute for Archangels, and arguably it might be even better. I don't really know what the numbers are. I've never crunched them, so I don't fucking know. But they're both really good. But Morello is sort of been taking over for red buff nowadays. You don't really need red buff anymore. Red buff has sort of fallen off because it got nerfed a bit. I think it got nerfed by like, I think it's 2% damage if I remember correctly. Yeah. So you used to deal 8% bonus damage. Now it's down to 2%. So even though, yeah, the extra attack speed is nice on Twisted Fate, he gets to cast more, Morello is just feeling so good, especially after the reworks as well. So just keep that in mind. With the Morello buffs and the red buff nerfs, Morello's a bit more nicer on Twisted Fate, but you don't have to. You might notice this is 4 rods completed in here, and that doesn't even include the spark up here. So, I mean, this comp loves eating up rods. So if you have a bunch of rods, definitely consider Twisted Fate and try to itemize in this sort of manner. But anyways, moving on, let's talk about our first. These are not in any particular order, by the way, but except heartsteel, I put it last for a reason, but we'll talk about that later. But again, none of these are in any particular order. We're gonna go from like some reroll to some standard and some reroll, whatever, but there's a bunch of reroll and a bunch of standard comps that are actually pretty viable in the current meta. So this patch is actually kind of nice. I'm not gonna lie. I'm personally kind of enjoying the patch, at least as of right now, but hopefully nothing super like terribly disgusting to play against pops up in the meta. That would be terrible, but right now it feels kind of nice. But anyways, moving on, Seraphine reroll. You might have seen somebody like Spicy Appies play this in the KDA Cup if you were watching along, but Seraphine reroll is a very, very strong 2-cost reroll comp that's sort of emerged. It's not a composition I would say that you can hard force, or you can even like try to situate yourself to like lean into. It's one of those compositions that, in case you didn't really notice, Seraphine items are very eerily similar to Twisted Fate items, and so this is sort of a composition that kind of emerged as sort of an alternative in case you don't think that you're going to be able to hit Twisted Fate, whether you are heavily contested for Twisted Fate, or maybe you just aren't finding like a disco opener, but you have the super fans, you find like a Seraphine 2, then like, okay, let's start thinking about Seraphine reroll. Ideally, the conditions for this comp is simply like it's like 2, maybe 3 Seraphines before you start rolling at 6, and you try to find Seraphine 3 like ideally as soon as possible. The best case scenario is you hit it at 3-2, but normally within tempo it's like 4-2, so it really depends on the game. Itemizations like Rabadon's, Shojin, and Morello is sort of BIS. Again, you might notice the Morello being BIS. This will be a common theme throughout a lot of the video, but we're actually maybe not anymore. We've already gone over the 2 main Morello holders. It's Seraphine and fucking Twisted Fate. But Rabadon is really, really good as well because that's actually her superfan item. It's the exact same as Ari. So having superfan on this board is super nice. The traits fit in all super well. And depending on the headliner, you actually have two ways of approaching this composition. The first one is raise the tempo spellweavers or vertical spellweaver. This is, I think, the more standard approach playing vertical spellweaver. You gotta play augments like raise the tempo. You gotta play augments like 2 healthy. They fit decently well into the board as well. I know Raptor was talking about how he really... Oh, by the way, so if you don't know who Raptor is, Demacian Raptor, you might see his name pop up. He's like a mod in every single big TFT YouTube channel, but he's also rank 1 EUNE. So very, very strong player. But nonetheless, he really likes 2 healthy. He thinks it's super, super strong. It's basically 3 healthy, but... or 3's a crowd. What's it called? Fucking 3's... It's 3's a crowd, right? 3's a crowd. 3's a crowd. A bunch of HP on the board. Super nice. And with Seraphine and Gragas, you get to basically play for free. You can even make an argument to play Gnar instead of like a Kennen, or probably instead of the Kennen here, or maybe even over the Lilia, so you can drop out of one of the KDAs. And the idea being is that you just get some extra 2 healthy value, and yeah, you drop Sentinels, but you can just play it down the line later. It's totally fine. But nonetheless, still very, very strong board to consider. I will say this though, this board does tend to fall off quite hard during the late game. The reason why it's so meta right now is because it actually punishes a lot of TF players. For those of you who don't know how Seraphine's ability works, especially with the headliner effect, because her headliner effect actually matters, is that every other cast she sends another cast that deals 40% damage and heals 40%. So the reason why it's so strong is because things like TF, which really loves clumping, and it really loves to like just everybody's just bunched together adjacent to each other, which by the way, we didn't mention this earlier, but if you get keepers, really strong augment on the TF board. But with Seraphine, she basically punishes the way that you position for disco. She just lobs her little little high note down, Kobe, swish, and then it just explodes everywhere and everything's dead. So you'd be surprised at the amount of damage that this thing pumps out. It's super duper strong. One last thing I want to mention as well, Infusion is surprisingly feeling pretty good in this composition. I don't really have the stats to back up this claim, but when I played it with Infusion, it felt super, super good. Just making sure Seraphine casts as much as possible. Super nice. Things like uplink as well. These augments are all great. Now, like I said before, there are 2 variations of this versus the vertical spellweaver, and you may have guessed, if you find the KDA headliner, you just play 7 KDA instead. Obviously, you don't really want to play raise the tempo. Doesn't really make sense. You're not playing a lot of spellweavers, not garnering a lot of value out of it. But if you are playing this variation instead, just take note, your frontline is super duper weak, and most of the time you're playing 7 KDA, but you're not playing it for very long. You're probably teching out of these 2 units, because even though Akali's not really a shitter by any means, you need more frontline. So things like the Alawi, things like a fucking Zac, or I don't fucking know, like Thresh 2, right? These are things you can consider, maybe for Guardian, maybe for Sentinel, stuff like that. Keep it in mind. Just be a little more flexible with you know, the units that you want to put on your board, in case you decide to say, hey, 7 KDA is pretty strong, but my front line is dying in like 5 seconds, so I need something else, right? There are some final alternatives as well. You could go for 3-star Nico, you could go for 3-star Echo, you could stay 7 and try to roll for these as well. I don't recommend it, but it's definitely something that you can consider, especially because, as we'll see very, very soon, 3-cost reroll is very, very strong with a bunch of different variations and lines. So hitting these 3 stars is not too much to ask for. Maybe Echo's a little much because TF players, but Nico, like nobody's playing super fans except for maybe some karthus akali players. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later down the line. Go grab some water, by the way. Jesus Christ, I've been talking out of my ass. But anyways, next up, Riven Reroll. Again, a very strong meta comp. This is probably, I would argue, this is, if you hit everything, it's the strongest comp in the game. It is, there's only one comp that is stronger, but we'll talk about it later. But Riven is the strongest comp in the game. It is, I don't do tier lists by any means, but this is definitely S+ tier, like S tier, S+ tier. It's really up there. The reason being is because Riven, with the 8-bit buffs in this current patch, does so much fucking damage, and she's so strong, and she just can't be stopped. And that's sort of the big thing with Riven. It's very, very easy to play, by the way. You just go level 7, you just look for that 8-bit chosen for Riven. You can take the Edgelord one, which I don't see a lot of people doing, but Beppo, who actually one-tricked Riven reroll from 200 to 900 LP, Challenger, forcing Riven 2020. This guy, I don't know why this is his playstyle. He just likes to one-trick certain things, and then he just runs with it, but then he does well with it, so I don't know. But he says that he's okay with content Edgelord Riven. He thinks it's fine. I don't know if I fully agree, but he's higher LP than me, so I don't know. But the main consensus, at least from what I've heard from a lot of people, is that you really want the 8-bit one. It's like significantly better because, excuse me, you don't have to play a shitty Corki on your board. And that's like the big thing. There is some discussion because if you play Cruel Pact, for example, you could maybe play into Riven and then you actually end up playing 2 8-bit instead. I've heard some level of discussion about that. Again, I've never really experimented with 2 8-bit, so I can't say. But from what I've seen, you really want 4 8-bit. 4 is sort of like that big break point where Riven really starts like pumping out a shitload of damage, especially if you're playing standard. You're not playing like Cruel Pact, March, right? You kind of want to play like this. You might also notice as well, Mordekaiser 3, this is a bonus. You will almost never find this when playing Riven Reroll, but if you do find it, congratulations, you basically won the game. Mordekaiser 3 is a super strong 3 cost as well. It's heavily underrated, and the only big reason it's heavily underrated is because Yone and Riven just significantly outcap any Mordekaiser carry board. But Mordekaiser 3 as your main tank, that thing is fucking disgusting. You might also notice Yone 3 is here as well. This will almost never happen. It's very rare you will get to a lobby where nobody's playing Yone Reroll at all, and you're playing Riven Reroll, so this almost never happens. It costs way too much money. Normally, your board will look something like this. It's like 40 gold cheaper. Definitely way more consistent. And one last thing, the positioning. You might notice that because we do have Mordekaiser 2, well, Mordekaiser 3, because my fucking rules, but Mordekaiser 2, Mordekaiser 3, your main tank, holding all the tank items here, right? Gargoyles, Warmogs is ideal in my opinion, but you can do a bunch of other things. Evan Shroud, you definitely want him on Evan Shroud on Mordekaiser because he survives the longest, but also you don't have to waste like a Last Whisper slot on Riven. Last Whisper slot on Riven. Jesus Christ. But items like IE, items like GS, really great for Riven, by the way. Third item, I think GS is statistically the best, but nonetheless doesn't really matter. But the reason why we position like this is because basically what ends up happening is that if you, let's say you position something like this, right? Let's say you position sort of a little more normally, if you will, right? Like Yone, Viego, whatever, right? And this is like your, maybe this is like sort of a little more like quote unquote standard, the way that most people position their units. The problem is that some of your opponent's board, and let me see if I can do a full board here. Some of your opponent's units, let's put a training dummy here for now so we can identify it. Let's say, for example, this unit is attacking the Yone, or maybe this unit is over here, it's attacking the Yone or the Mordekaiser, it really depends. But let's say it starts attacking the Yone and the Yone dies, and the Riven is starting to like do her thing. She's like dashes forward and then starts like doing her Riven things, right? Like launching herself forward or whatever, and she kind of like starts to like, dash through units, gets to the back here, and the problem is that this Yone is gonna die super fast. And once this Yone dies, the crowd dives whatever into the back and just explodes, then this unit suddenly wants to target the Riven because this is the closest. So the reason why we position the way that we do here, and we position like this, basically backlining everything except for the Riven and the Mordekaiser, is because no matter what unit your opponent has, no matter where they are, I'm just going to throw a bunch of dummies onto the board here real quick just so we can see, but no matter where they are, this Mordekaiser is the closest. So it will always target the Mordekaiser no matter what, and then the Mordekaiser is going to take the longest to die, even if it is getting fully single targeted, and the Riven can do her thing, do Riven things, and just bounce around the board, killing everything. So this is a very interesting positioning tech. I saw this from Appies, I think a couple weeks ago, but nonetheless, really cool tech. I think it's super worth doing, especially if you're playing around Riven Reroll. Now, by the way, if you want this Beppo tweet, I'll link it in the description below if you want to see it. I got you guys. But moving on, Yone Reroll. Now, Yone Reroll, it's a little different. The board isn't exactly the same, but for a couple of reasons. The first one is because Yone is a crowd diver, so you really do want crowd diver active in any sense. 4 is typically the big breakpoint that used to exist for Yone, but because 4 crowd diver got, I believe 4, it might have gotten nerfed, I don't remember. 6 definitely got nerfed, but nowadays 4 crowd diver Yone kind of feels weaker. Like, it doesn't feel as good, and I don't think it's because the composition is necessarily worse, but it's because everything else is just much stronger. So he's having a little bit more tough times, like solo carrying fights, because you have like an Evelyn and a Katarina on your board. 6 crowd diver Yone is still really fucking strong, still wins out a lot of lobbies, so you don't have to worry too much about it. You might also notice that we're not doing the solo positioning with the Mordekaiser in this scenario, unlike the back with like the Riven board. And the reason being is because in this board, you kind of want the shitters to die. Like, kind of, not ASAP, but when they die, they provide value. So, for example, right, Yone has a very good matchup against something like Disco, something against, like, let's say your opponent is playing something like TF. This is a composition that will absolutely steamroll a TF board. So, the thing about this board, though, is that the way that you position your units actually really matters. So, for example, I put Twisted Fate here specifically because in this example, let's say your opponent is playing Twisted Fate and it's over here in this bottom D7 corner, right? So, what ends up happening is that these units will start to die, but then what ends up happening is that these units die, they crowd dive onto the Twisted Fate, he gets stunned, and then Yone is just, like, bashing things in their head, bashing their skulls in, and then he's just dashing, suddenly he's on the Twisted Fate. So Twisted Fate just keeps getting stun locked, and then by the time he's done being stun locked, or maybe he's like got a single cast off, it's too late. Yone's already back there, absolutely giving him the time of his life, and then suddenly Twisted Fate is dead, and you've won the fight. So that is why we don't really do the positioning as much with crowd divers, because with crowd divers, you really want to get the value out of the crowd divers just leaping. You want the shitter ones to be on the opposite side of your yone, because your yone is going to travel like basically forward most of the times. And you just, you're chilling with the yone with the, obviously behind the Mordekaiser, so it doesn't take first aggro. So that is why we do that the way that we do. Another thing to note is that you can take literally any headliner for yone. It's not as strict as Riven. Again, Beppo argues otherwise, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to say it's 8-bit Riven almost all the time. Yone, you can take heartsteel, you can take edgelord, you can take crowd diver, but the cap is highest with crowd diver because crowd diver gives you 6. If you don't hit the crowd diver, you hit edgelord or you hit heartsteel, it's fine. If you don't have a lot of money, you should probably buy it and you should probably just run with it. If you have a lot of money to spare or a lot of HP to spare, you can try to greed it by buying it, selling it, and then trying to go from there. So that is something to keep in mind. But again, yone reroll, definitely you want to be sort of playing around the crowd divers whenever possible, but there is some discussion. You just play this board instead, and you just go for yone 3 instead. I don't know how I feel about that. You're kind of playing more to edgelords and you have 0 crowd diver, but I've heard some people discuss it. I've never tested it myself, but I've also never seen anyone play that before. I've only heard of it, so I don't know what the hell's going on over there. But anyways, that's something to keep in mind. Finally, itemizations for yone, i.e. Hodge Titans. This is very strict. You cannot really play yone without these items. He really needs these 3 specifically, and if you don't have these 3 specifically, you will have a much worse time. Obviously, you can make this argument like, oh, the Bis Police or whatever, but yone specifically actually needs i.e. Hodge Titans. He uses all the stats of Titans very well. i.e. is very good on him. Hodge is very good. The more damage you do, the more you heal, so Hodge is enough. You don't need BT. That's basically the synopsis. So that's why this is the best itemization, and it's not even close. One last thing, Gargantuan Resolve. This used to be an augment that was sort of like a reverse augment back in like the last patch, because you would take this augment and then it was shit. But now if you take this augment, it seems to be okay. So I just wanted to clear that up. Definitely really great on yone. Also another one, the edgelord one. I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but there is an edgelord augment as well. Live for danger. Definitely could take this as well and play around this. It's totally fine. Obviously live for danger is better on the Riven board, but it works just fine. Healing augments are really great, and funny enough, if you have Gargantuan and you have a healing augment, a really strong one by the way, something like Harmist's 3, which I will pull up for you in such a second, starts with HA, haha, you can drop the Hodge completely, and you can just go double Titans with Gargantuan. This is, surprisingly enough, you kind of run into this situation kind of often. You'd be kind of surprised how often, like, you take Gargantuan 2-1, you're like, hey, me yone slash Stefan, and then 3-2 hits, you're like, hey, that's Harmist's, and I don't have a Hodge yet, and then you can just go double Titans, and like, this is super strong. So really, really good stuff, so keep it in mind. Next composition to move over to, and this is a composition that is, I guess it is a reroll comp, but it's not a composition you play very often, so I think it's important to talk about, but it requires a lot of things to go right. So I don't think this is like a 1 in like 50 type of composition. This is not something that you would play very often, but it is superfan headliner Gnar, and do it for the fans Gnar specifically. The reason why this comp is not really like a composition I'm gonna spend too much time on is because, first off, you need specifically headliner superfan Gnar. If you do have it and you have a lot of Gnars, let's say you have Gnar 2 and then you hit the superfan Gnar and you have like i.e. Hodge, sure, try it. But that is like the only time you would ever try to play this composition. If you watch Dish So play during KDA Cup on day 3, you'll know he took a game where he took Do It For The Fans at 2-1, and then he was like, fuck it, me Gnar, and then he rolled over Pentakill Gnar, and then he rolled over Noasha Gnar, and then he finally found Superfan Gnar. By the time he found it, it was too late. He went like 5th or 6th. It was just not a good time. But when the conditions fall right into place, this composition can be really, really strong. His radiant item is Radiant Styrax, which is super duper good on him. They did buff the comp a little bit because of the way that his jump used to work. He used to jump immediately and then take aggro, but now your units will take aggro and then he jumps. So there's a really, really slight delay, which feels a lot better, and that buffed the comp actually quite a bit. Things like i.e. Hodge is probably BIS in my opinion. You can do Titans and BT. That's also completely fine, but I do think Gnar has enough healing from just Mosher and just being just who he is as a unit, so that doesn't make any sense. But like, I think with Moshers, it's kind of enough. Like, you don't need BT. Like, Hodge is fine. He has enough survivability. The shield from BT doesn't really matter too much, in my opinion. So Hodge IE is fine. He just lacks the damage sometimes to clean off some units, especially when he gets stuck on Giga Tanks. So just keep in mind that is something that he might struggle with. So that's why he isn't too popular. But when he jumps correctly into the backline, he can actually one-tap like your opponent's carries and just win fights instantly. So it's a bit of a coin flippy comp. It's very fun, but if you've played it before, you know it's a good time. It's just, it can be a little difficult to hit everything. Obviously, we have 4 Guardian here because we have the York as well. There are some people who would argue that you also want to play Kale 3 on this board. I would say that is bullshit. The reason why is because even though Kale is a good unit, you have to fit in Edgelords. So you have to fit in the Kale, but you have to fit in the Viego, but you already have the Gnar. And then, so that's already 3, sure, but then who's the Edgelord? And then you need the 5 superfans. It gets messy very quickly. So I don't think Kale 3 is that necessary for this comp. I think Gnar is enough, and you just flex whatever, usually something like a Karthus, something like, I don't know, like maybe even Ezreal. I don't know, it depends. But nonetheless, still very fun comp. Definitely something to consider. The stats on it real quick, it's a 4.28. So again, it's not amazing by any means, but when the conditions fall into place, it's definitely a line you can consider. Next one we'll talk about, and oh, this is a doozy. It's fucking Executioner Flex. Now, Executioner Flex sort of revolves around these core units. It's like Twitch, Vex, Amumu, Pantheon. There are some obvious lines we'll talk about, but there are also some like niche lines we can talk about. And I mean, the main synopsis is basically Executioner got buffed, 4 and 6 got buffed quite a bit, so these lines are actually viable now. So there are a bunch of reroll lines, but also standard lines that fall within the Executioner tree. And quite honestly, you could probably play Executioners and like Executioner 2020 and maybe even climb like pretty consistently. The reason being is that there's so many lines within this one trait alone, so you have a lot to work with. First one is the big obvious one. We won't spend too much time talking about this, but I'm sure you've heard of it by now. Twin Terror reroll with Twitch and Vex. Really, really strong comp. Obviously, you just roll on 6, try to hit the Twitch 3, the Pantheon 3, go to 7, and you try to look for the Vex and the Amumu, and you 3-star all of them, and it's a good time. The only thing you have to really consider is that, hey, if you are playing this comp, make sure nobody else like Twin Terror, and make sure nobody else at Twitch, and make sure nobody's playing Country. Those are like the only 3 things you have to really look out for. If you do find yourself playing into Country players, you do find yourself in a bit of a pickle, because the problem is that this comp without Vex 3 surprisingly feels a lot worse than you'd expect. You kind of need Vex 3 to cap out the board. It's a very important upgrade to have. It's a very strong unit. She holds all your rods, all your AP items that you're not going to be utilizing on your Twitch. So that is something to keep in mind. You really do want Vex 3 to win out with this board. Just to give you just a better idea as to like how integral it is to actually try to hit this Vex 3 and how important it is. If you're playing it against with other Country players, you kind of really need Twitch Vex and you need the Vex 3 because look at the stats. If you have a Vex 2, oh, well, I mean, I guess it's hard to isolate it, but with Vex 3, you're averaging a 2.67. With Vex 2 on the board, it's a 3.67, but this is slightly inflated because with Vex 2 on the board, that means you either have Vex 3 or you don't have Vex 3. But this would be probably closer to like a 4 or 4.2 in my opinion if it's like Vex 2, Vex 2. I can't, oh, you know what? We can isolate for Vex 3 here. So let's just do that. Let's just isolate for Vex 3. 3.72. Okay, so it's not the worst in the world. So actually, very playable actually, but I'm actually just mistaken. So, fuck it. Just, if there's Country reroll players, fine. I will say this though, when you're itemizing your tank, you almost always would rather prefer a Mumu holding the tank items rather than the Pantheon. Sure, you are 3-starring this Pantheon pretty quickly, but if you, let's say you don't find a lot of Pantheons, or you are like sort of equal in terms of Amumus and Pantheons, just focus on the Amumu items. He's just so much of a better tank than Pantheon. He can hold basically everything you're chilling. You might also notice we don't have Pantheon on the board here, like the second one that you get after 3-starring, and the reason being is just because Twin Terror gives you crit, and it gives you attack speed and some HP, but out of all those stats, Pantheon is only going to really utilizing the HP. It's the Twin Terror on your front line doesn't really matter too much, but stats are stats. It's just nice to have, so just keep it in mind. On level 8, you're usually playing something like a Samira to fill out the 4 Executioner. Excuse me. I should also probably mention that your headliner is almost always going to be Executioner Twitch, so just keep that in mind. Itemizations like Guardbreaker GS are best. IE was sort of thought to be Twitch's best items, but then as the meta evolved, people sort of realized, hey, IE is good. Not bad by any means, but Guardbreaker GS much better. And you can even, instead of going IE, you can even go something like Hodge, and that's totally fine. Really strong item user. Just, you know, look a little more into the stats before itemizing. Again, AP items go on Vex, any tank items go on Mumu. Very straightforward. Moving on, we also have Vex 3-4 Executioner. Now, this is sort of what happens if you don't hit Twin Terror. If you don't hit Twin Terror, you can sort of play this Vex 3 Akali 2 board. And what this basically is Karthus Akali with extra steps. And what I mean by that is, you're basically a Mumu 3, Vex 3, your Vex reroll, but you're now 4 Executioner, and Akali is just going to basically clean up the back line while Vex works on the front line and just decimates everything. It's a fine board. It's nothing like terrible by any means, but like this is a line that you won't see people play too often because I think people have been too hyper fixated on just having to play Twin Terror with Twitch no matter what. But you don't need it. You can, the stats are fine. If you have Twitch with 4 Executioner, when you exclude Twin Terrors, guess what? You're still chilling with like a 4.1 average. And you know, if you hit Vex 3 is a 3.17, obviously Vex 2 looking a little worse. But I mean, this is because you're going to be playing around Vex anyways, so that makes a lot of sense. So anyways, really strong board with 4 Guardian, and actually I think if you put in 4 Guardian into the stats go up actually quite a lot. Yeah, 3.85. So definitely a really strong line to consider. This is definitely something you can play. Nothing really changes in terms of itemizations. You're just itemizing the Akali. Twitch item holds for your Akali until then. AP items obviously go on Vex. You won't be able to itemize in Karthus as well, just because there's too much AP, right? But this is a good balance of items, so definitely something to consider. I wouldn't say this is like an S tier board by any means, but it's a good way to get your top 4. It's a very strong board if you manage to get everything online on your conditions. Again, this is your level 7 board, so you have a really strong level 7 board, so you should be good to go for a while. But anyways, moving on, for Executioner, again, for Executioner Flex, there's a bunch of different lines, but this is actually the sort of the quote-unquote new country line that sort of emerged. Again, it's for Executioner, for Guardian. It's not that different from like this like Akali version of the board, but this version obviously is a little bit better because you are playing around 3-star Samira, 3-star Vex. It's basically country reroll. The only difference is that 5 country isn't as good as it used to be. Just because 4 Execution is so much better. So you'd rather just take out those extra country units and just play some other stuff for like frontline, things like the Nico Pantheon for like punk rolls, which is super cheap, makes it easier to hit everything, but also for Guardian, very strong, especially throughout the mid game. Also, Amumu 3 is on the horizon, very strong tank that you can play around. This is overall a very strong board, and if you manage to get everything, you can top 4 very easily. Super strong board. If this is something, again, this is something you'd only really consider if you have Collector at like 2-1, and then you can Collector IE Samira, and she just does a shitload of damage, farms shitload of money. Really strong. Again, really good stats, 3.96, super dope. 3-star Samira, 3.49, so keep that in mind. Finally, the big one that I believe we are all aware of, which is, this is, I believe, Karthus Akali. This is 5 pentakill with superfan, and you basically have triple carries. You get to play around Viego, you get to play around the Akali, you get to play around the Karthus, doesn't really matter. Does not matter, you can slam 80 AP items, it does not fucking matter. Slam it on whoever, just make sure you have 3 of a type on a certain carry, and you play around this board at level 8. You roll for the Viego, Akali, or the Karthus headliner, but everything else is super duper cheap. Gnar is great, but you can eventually switch this out for something like a Mordekaiser. Kale is great, but this, you need this for the Edgelord eventually. You do want to eventually tech out of superfans with this board. Usually that's like stage 6 if you manage to get that far. Usually stage 6 is like, okay, we've had enough time, we've farmed enough items, like, let's get out of these super fans, we don't need them anymore. But super strong board to be playing around. This is a very meta board, very good against Twisted Fate. But it does have some really poor matchups, things like Viego, things like Riven. It can definitely struggle a little bit with. But yeah, very strong board, not much else to really add. The superfan items, just in case you want to know, Hodge for Akali, Archangels for Karthus. Viego is actually Titans, which isn't that great. So I would say that if you're gonna play the superfans, ideally, it's not gonna be perfect, but ideally you have like headliner Akali or headliner Karthus. You know, see how it plays out, play it by ear. But nonetheless, very strong board. Moving on, we are slowly beating down and finally getting to the meat and potatoes, but now we are into Pentakill. Pentakill, this is the vertical line. This is with Karthus Viego. This is, in my opinion, slightly worse than just Karthus Akali, but this is still a line that you can consider if you find yourself a Pentakill headliner. I say Pentakill headliner specifically because that way you can drop one of them and you can play up a unit. Typically, you drop the, I believe it's the Olaf, and the reason being is that it just is, it's an Olaf, like who gives a shit, like past like stage 2. But Viego's a super strong carry that you can play around, and it's a very straightforward board as well. You can just play around 7 Pentakill with Karthus and Viego, things like the GA, i.e. Hodge, Biss in my opinion, but maybe there is something that's a little bit better. But really simple line. All you do is you play the shit, 7 pentakill. You can play, you need 3 edgelord if you want Viego to do stuff, but it's gonna be Yone, Riven, Yasuo, Kayn, whoever, does not matter. Very simple board. In terms of like your debuffs, Kale can actually hold quite a bit of them. So things like red buff, things like Last Whisper, Kale's actually a great holder. If you find that York pretty early though, feel free to just smack these onto him instead. He'll do a much better job spreading it than Kale ever could dream of. But nonetheless, really strong board, not much else to really add. Just make sure that if you're playing Karthus, you have a mana generation item, things like Adapticone, things like Shojin, which is best. Blue buff, not ideal, but if you're in a really bad spot, slam it, pray for the best. It's probably a top 6. Moving on though, pentakill surprisingly actually has one other line that has sort of emerged, which is I've labeled it under pentakill, but it's more like vertical bruisers, and this is reroll olaf. Now, reroll olaf was a composition that was really prevalent in the PvE, but has only recently emerged with the current patch. People were sort of realizing at the end of the last patch that too big to fail was actually a pretty strong augment, and people were already considering reroll olaf, but it wasn't that great. But this patch, it's suddenly a lot better. A lot of yapping today. But this board is really, really strong, but you can't really force it. It's like if you have a couple olafs and then you find the olaf headliner and it's +2 bruiser, which is way better than +2 pentakill, by the way. Then you can be like, okay, I will consider olaf. Gargantuan resolve is actually, in my opinion, sort of an olaf force. You don't ideally want to force olaf. If you take gargantuan and you find yourself with like 0 olafs, just play yone or riven and you're good to go. You actually have a way out, right? But when it comes to olaf and you have gargantuan resolve and you have an olaf opener, you are in a really, really good spot. You just go titans bt +1. Typically it's another titans or another bt. I don't think it's another bt, I think it's another titans, but he utilizes that decently well, and he is just a menace. Once this thing is 3-star, nothing can actually kill him. So what you might notice a lot of people doing is that they sort of play like vertical bruisers, and they do it because the more HP that olaf is missing, the more the more attack speed that he gets, right? Which is super great. So more HP, the better. He just survives longer, just just auto attacks like crazy, and he clears boards like no other. As long as you have 3 pentakill in and you have as many bruisers as you can fit in, he will do massive work. Just make sure you just 3-star him and you get to your items as soon as possible. Again, you want to be 3-starring this by like 3-1, but most scenarios he will tempo you to 9. So let's talk about how you cap out at 9, because that's kind of important. When you're capping out at 9, you need to be playing around either 2 outs. You're either playing around the Viego dual carry or you're playing around the Karthus dual carry. It really depends on what your secondary items get dropped on, right? Like, let's say, for example, off your olaf items, you start getting dropped like rods and tears. Think about Karthus. If you're getting dropped like IE, Hodge, swords, and whatever, just think about Viego. Very easy to play. So you can just flex around those two. Again, it's just 6 bruiser, 3 pentakill, and then whatever you flex around, just make sure that they're activated. And what I mean by that is, for example, with Viego, make sure you get a cane or like a fucking yone or riven or whoever, just to get that edgelord activated. Same with karthus as well. If you want karthus in, make sure you have the executioner in, something like an akali, something like a vex might actually be better in this spot in most cases. The reason being is because a lot of AD flex, a lot of yone, a lot of riven. Vex is the big ultimate counter against them. The AoE CC is just really, really strong against those boards, so maybe something you consider. But nonetheless, make sure that executioner is activated here or edgelord is activated here. But very easy to cap out. You basically just get to go fast 9 and you're chilling. One last thing to mention, too big to fail, heavy hitters. These augments are also really, really strong in this comp, so just keep that in mind. Heavy hitters, I would actually argue, is like S++ tier in this comp specifically, so keep that in mind. This is basically a free like top 3, top 2. So if everything lines up fine, then yeah, really good board, really fun to play. Lastly, and I say this for last, thank god I say this for last, and take a breather, right? Take a breather, pat yourselves on the back. This has been a long ass video. I'm looking at the timer right now, we're at 37 minutes, and maybe I'll cut out like 10 seconds out of the intro, but we have been here for a while, so pat yourselves on the back. You are learning. But finally, let's talk about heartsteel. Now, heartsteel, holy shit. Heartsteel. This trait is so fucking hard to play. It is so hard to play, and you have people who are in Masters, in GM, even in Challenger, struggling to pivot this trait. It is a very difficult trait to play, and you might be wondering to yourself, why the fuck would I ever play this trait? Me fucking yone brain, I don't give a shit, I just reroll for fun, I'm a climb. If you want to be a better player, if you want to improve at TFT, if you want to be really good and strong this set, especially if you're competing, you need to know how to play heartsteel, and you need to know how to pilot it, and it's gonna be hard. It will be hard. There's a lot of lines, there's a lot of variations, and quite honestly, I believe the most of us don't even have variations memorized. There's just too many different ways to play this comp, so it's really playing on the fly and figuring out your board in real time on the fly. Heartsteel is sort of the big flex trait of this set. If you care a lot about playing flex, if you can find that Heartsteel sometime in the game, it actually does not matter when you find it, obviously earlier the better, but whenever you find it, you start playing around it, you start thinking, okay, 80 flex, I can start thinking about Ezreal, start thinking about Caitlyn, start thinking about all these other units like Zed, and I can start playing around these units and, you know, trying to flex my board and try to figure out ways to spike it. You should have a very strong understanding of the set, very strong understanding of the traits, very strong understanding of what makes units strong. Like, for example, like with Z2, you want 4 crowd diver, right? Ezreal, you want 2 big shot, stuff like this. You need to have these in mind already understood, and then you can start to try to play into this and try to succeed. But it's very, very, very hard, and it's also the reason why Ezreal's like fucking average placement is like a 4.9. He's actually really, really strong right now. He's very strong right now, but it's hard to pilot, and that's what makes this comp so difficult. Ezreal itself, not a bad unit, just a very hard trait. But anyways, let's finally talk about it. So the first one that we need to talk about is the cores, and this isn't really a comp. Like, again, there's too many variations, so let's talk about the cores. There are 2 cores specifically when it comes to heartsteel. This is the Set Cassante and it's the Yone Kayn. These are the 2 big ones. Obviously, you're going to have Ezreal on your board. This is going to be your main carry. This doesn't really change throughout most games. If you low roll on your headliners on 4-2 and you're rolling, you don't find the Ezreal headliner at all, or maybe you don't find like Ezreal 2 at all, and you have to play something like a Zed Chosen, you're gonna be on your own on this one, because I'm not gonna go over that. But in this scenario, let's assume that we are either Ezreal headliner or we have the Ezreal 2. It shouldn't be too difficult. It's not a very contested unit. So if this is the case, what do these 2 cores represent? The first one is Set Cassante. This is sort of your main bread and butter for like stage 4, stage 5. And I say this because it's very easy to tech in like decent quality units that will do a lot for your board throughout stage 4, and these units will help you get to 9. So for example, units like the Echo, units like Mordekaiser, units like Blitzcrank, right, for your Sentinel bonus, units like Zac, units like Alawi, right? These units are all really good, but these are units that you are sort of like teching in to try to flex onto your board to cap out. But if you really want to cap out with this board, most of the time you're dropping Cassante and Set at level 9, not immediately, when it makes sense, all right? When it makes sense, as in your board doesn't get weaker. When it makes sense for like Yone 2, Kayn 2. And once you find this, you can start thinking about edgelords. And edgelords include things like the Kale, so that you can have pentakill in, so you can play around Yorick, and you can play around Viego as a dual carry for your Ezreal, and you can cap out higher. And if you have a Kayn 2 AP items, you can play around Kayn. If you don't know this already, but with heartsteel, you kind of want to keep heartsteel activated even as the game is progressing. It's not a trait that is sort of more like underground or like mercenary back in like previous sets, where it's a trait that once you've cashed out, you tech out of completely and you never touch it ever again. In this set, it's different. You want to play around heartsteel. You want to keep it teched in because of the way that the mechanic works, where you auto cash out every 4 rounds, and you can actually utilize that to your advantage by slowly but surely pumping more and more resources into your board to eventually outcap everybody. Heartsteel has the highest cap out of every single board in the set currently on this patch. You can play heartsteel and actually go first every single time if you can pilot it correctly, assuming you got heartsteel like relatively early. You can play around it. So that is what I mean by heartsteel being the hardest, because it's the hardest, but it's the most rewarding. It's very high risk, but it's very high reward, and it's very fun. It's just so fun. If you're like a tryhard, you're like sweaty, it's a very, very fun. So this is an example like level 8 board that you could have things like the Echo 2, the Cassante, the Zac 2, the Set 2. You can have like 4 big shot. You don't necessarily need this. You could even tech down, and you could even play like 5 heartsteel for like some of stage 4. Your board's gonna be pretty fucking weak, but this is definitely something that you could consider. A lot of different ways to flex around, but this is sort of like your stage 4 trying to get to level 9 board, right? So that is something to keep in mind. You really want to be flexing around a bunch of units and try to, you know, do I have HP to spare? Can I go for 5 heartsteel and try to cash out a little bit extra? Or do I really want to be like, okay, you know what, I need to stop dying, like let me get some real units on my fucking board? But this is a board, again, you play until level 9, and then level 9 we pivot out and we try to cap out. Again, the main quote-unquote line, I say that very lightly with a grain of salt, it's Kayn and Yone, and you want to play around Kayn 2, Yone 2, and this is when you've really started to cap out with things like AP. You have a really strong AP holder with Kayn, and you have a bunch of different strong legendaries that you can cap out with, and this is, again, just an example. But some traits to keep in mind: 3 pentakill is always really nice to have on endgame boards, just because the whole team-wide buff is massive, especially if you're playing around a Yorick. It's very easy to just like itemize him as a carry as well. Things like Sterax, things like BT, if you need the utility, things like Morello, things like Last Whisper, he can hold it. It's fine. He's a very flexible item holder. So keeping 3 pentakill in, especially when you have a York on your board, is very, very crucial. Things like Thresh 2 is also really nice because you have York, then you want to play around Thresh. Things like Zac, for the bruisers, if you want a Lowy. Let's say you find like a Kiana 2, totally fine as well. Guess what? It fits because we have a Yone and we get Crowd Diver in and we are chilling. Don't have the true damage, a little unfortunate, but it's fine. Maybe we take down the Thresh 2 for like an Echo 2 instead in certain scenarios. Like, it really changes. It really changes per game. It's very, very, you have to be very flexible with this. There are other ways of capping out too. You don't just need the Ezreal. Obviously, you can also get things like Jhin. You can get things like double Ezreal 2 if you find like a lot of Ezreals. Things like Lucian, and you're playing around like Jazz backliners with like Bard and things like Misfortune, right? Capping out with all of these traits on your board. Really, really, really flexible play. So just keep that in mind. I know we didn't talk about the early game very much, but all you have to know is this. For the early game, when it comes to heartsteel, kill as many units as you can. Win or lose, quite honestly, doesn't really matter. If you lose, great. But if you win, fine. It's not the end of the world if you win. You'll be okay. 3 heartsteel is like one of the better openings because you got to play 80 flex. It's a very uncontested and unpopular line because it's so difficult. It's high skill cap, but also like no one's touching Ezreal outside of this line. So heartsteel is really great. But on top of that, you get to sort of try to find 5 heartsteel, and 5 heartsteel is super strong. 5 heartsteel throughout the mid game is like one of like the things that it's like it's just not balanced in the pro scene, because if you hit 5 heartsteel at like 3-1, you've kind of won the game. You've basically been able to give yourself so many resources throughout the mid game that once stage 4 hits and you're playing around your Ezreal or whatever, you're trying to start win fights again, you have so many more resources compared to everybody else. So your board is significantly stronger. That's why you hear a lot of pros complain about 5 heartsteel. It's too strong. But if you manage to find 5 heartsteel, at least on this patch during stage 3, you should play it. And one last thing with the new heartsteel changes, with the raise the stakes option, you get to choose to raise the stakes or you just choose to cash out. You only raise the stakes if you know for a fact you can lose for certain. By the way, if you get griefed, that is a problem. You cannot get griefed of your thing. So if somebody else is trying to raise the stakes, really consider whether or not you want to raise the stakes as well. It's very risky. But if you do manage to raise the stakes, you should almost always do it if you think you can manage a 4 loss. It is almost always worth it as long as you're able to cash out before 4-1 or 4-2, before you gotta do your roll down to try to find your heartsteals and your whatevers and pivoting into a really strong level 8 board. If you can do it before then, consider it. But most of the time, I would argue, most of the time it's only like 1 or 2 heartsteel players. So just make sure to scout, make sure that you aren't winning against anybody. Open your board if you have to. Like, open as in like, don't actually sell units, but like make sure your board's like super weak, like frontlining your backliner, for example, right? Make sure it's super weak, secure the streak, because if you're able to get that 4 loss correctly throughout the raise the stakes time, you will be heavily rewarded, especially with 5 heartsteel. It's super strong with 5 heartsteel. To be honest, raise the stakes with 3 heartsteel, I don't know if it's actually that worth it, but it's something to keep in mind. One last final thing to note, if you are struggling with heartsteel, if this is something that you are very unfamiliar with, or it's something that is very difficult for you, that is, one, completely fucking understandable. It's hard. But the best heartsteel player, in my opinion, right now is Setsuko. He is easily the best heartsteel player because, one, he is very, very good at being efficient with his turns. He knows what he's looking for. He knows what he needs almost all the time. So he's rolling. He knows what to find. He knows what to click. It's never that difficult. He's also very quick with his APM, so he's able to make these transitions pretty seamlessly. Number 2, he is one of the best players in North America when it comes to capping out his board, understanding what units to play, what traits need to be active in order to win out certain fights, win out certain matches, and overall spike the power of his board. So if you are struggling with heartsteel, I highly recommend going over to Setsuko's channel. I will link it down below if you need it, which if you know me but you don't know Setsuko, that's kind of insane, to be honest. This guy is so well known across the TFT community, but I will link his Twitch down below. Please go check out his VODs, check out the games he played, especially during KDA Cup. He played very beautifully across his heartsteel games, and you can see the way that this guy pilots heartsteel and how it should be done as a quote-unquote near perfect example, if not perfect example. But that should basically do it for this meta-analysis. It's been like 48 fucking minutes. My buddy is waiting for me at the cafe. I gotta go see him. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. This is a dense patch. There's a lot to cover, a lot of different lines. But if there's something you think I missed, something you think that I should have covered, let me know. I will try to address it in the comments. But until then, I will see you guys all later. Take care, guys, and happy climbing.